Hello and welcome to York Universe, the Toronto and Astronomy podcast, written and presented by the students, faculty, alumni, and friends of York University. You will now find us wherever podcasts are distributed. I am Paul Mackin, one of your hosts this evening, and I'm joined by Professor Mary Helen Armour. We are broadcasting live from the Allan Carswell Observatory, located at the Keele campus of York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. York Universe broadcasts every Monday at 9 p.m. local Toronto time, or currently 1 a.m. Tuesday Universal Time at York U Observatory. We also run in consort with our online public viewing, or as we call it, the OPV feed, run by the observatory staff. To navigate to our live show or to find out more about us, please check out our website at yorku.ca/science/observatory and follow the link to our online public viewing chat on YouTube. Any questions or comments you may have on past shows or suggestions for future topics, please send us an email at observe@yorku.ca. You can also connect with us on Instagram with the handle at YorkU Observatory or on Facebook at Allan I. Carswell Ob. All our programs are free, but if you'd like to make a donation, and we would certainly appreciate that, please see our website at yorku.ca/science/observatory. We'll be monitoring the YouTube chat for questions and post content. Tonight's weather is looking pretty good for observing, and I believe we have the staff at the domes, which will be open and likely be mixing live and archival images on the OPV. So, Mary Helen, how are the skies looking in your neck of the woods?
Oh, not bad right now. It's been the first sunny day we've had in a while, so I'm hoping to get out and see some stars on my back deck after we are done here. So, because I live just north of Toronto, so I actually have pretty good seeing on the nights when it's clear.
Yeah, it's funny. I have a number of telescopes, and I sometimes use them and sometimes I don't. And of course, we've got access to the facilities at school as well. But my wife has always nagged me about not taking my telescope out. Well, as we'll talk later, I got a new little telescope, just a small one, very portable, easy to set up. And every single night it's clear right now. I've been out there, and now my wife's complaining that I don't get to bed till 1 o'clock, 1 or 2 in the morning because I'm observing. So that's tonight, what we're going to be doing right after this. I'm going to be out back, and I think my dog will come back, and she wonders why I'm fiddling with all these strange lights and things like that. But it'll be a lot of fun. Um, yeah, so I mean, let's get into our show this evening with a bit of space history. Our theme for today is projects, and we're going to start off with the project of Mars exploration. On May 25th, 2008, the Mars Phoenix spacecraft successfully landed near the North Polar regions of Vastistas Borealis. The history of that lander is quite a story in itself. In December 1999, the Mars polar landing was approaching the surface of Mars. But as it fired its landing engine to slow down, a sensor misfired in one of the legs, and it caused it to shut down the engine prematurely. It actually thought it had landed. And of course, then it immediately just fell to the ground and crashed. But this was actually a double tragedy, as the lander was part of a mission project called the Mars Surveyor 1998, which was the year they were both landed. And that also included the Mars Climate Orbiter. That other mission, in what was probably one of the most epic mess ups of all time, failed to go into orbit because the flight operations team at Lockheed Martin was using imperial units and NASA was using metric units. And no one really sure what happened to the lander because it either crashed on Mars or skipped off the atmosphere and into deep space. But this failure reminded us of the fact that Mars is hard, and we'll talk a little bit later about why that is the case. And I'm quite adamant about this. This is all the more reason to only ever use metric units. As a physicist, the thought of using anything other than that is nightmarish. So this is definitely hundreds of millions of dollars worth of evidence that you should never use imperial units. Anyway, no matter. There was enough hardware left over from the Mars Polar Lander that a new lander was built, and it was aptly called Phoenix because it rose from the ashes of the failed mission. And it launched on August 4th, 2007. It followed uh, the most straightforward landing profile on Mars. And Mars is really difficult to land on. So it used the atmosphere to slow itself down, first with a heat shield, and then it deployed a supersonic parachute. And then finally, it ignited a rocket and to softly land at 68 degrees northern latitude. So that's really quite far north on Mars. It had a robot arm and a camera. It had on the camera, it had an imager that it could look at in very close detail, stereo images of the surface. It had a thermal and evolved gas analyzer and a suite of instruments labeled the microscopy, electrochemistry, and conductivity analyzer, which was actually a whole bunch of different experiments all trundled together. And it had a planned mission. Primary mission of 90 days, but it survived out to 157 days. And then the lack of sunlight for its solar panels led to failed communications. And they looked at it again a couple of years later. And one of the things they predicted is when it got so dark that there was basically no sunlight at that latitude for most of the winter. Carbon dioxide would freeze out of the atmosphere and accumulate on the solar panels, and eventually they'd collapse under their own weight. And sometime later, actually they actually got an image of it from space, and you could see the solar panels had fallen off. The mission was an unqualified success. A landing imaging camera that was on there wasn't used for technical reasons, and there were some early communication challenges in the mission. But Phoenix did discover water ice at the Martian polar region. It confirmed snowfall and discovered perchlorates and some associated chemistry in that region, which might offer evidence against finding life in that part of Mars. Interestingly, though, and just this year, NASA undertook a study to determine what bacteria might be found in the clean room where the spacecraft, including Phoenix, are assembled, and found 26 possible contaminant species. So it's possible that, in spite of efforts for biological protection, because it's called a clean room for that reason, among other reasons, but they want to not put Earth bacteria on Mars. There may be some Earth-based bacteria on Mars and surviving, because bacteria can be quite robust. Um, as NASA said at the time of the Mars Surveyor project failure, Mars is hard, but NASA and others have kept at it, and it has NASA, knock on wood, been very successful with its Mars mission since then. Uh, Mars is part of an international effort with the Arab states and the Chinese, the European Space Agency, India, Japan, and the USA, all working towards various Mars goals. Now, the NASA Mars projects are a fork in the road right now because of budget reviews, but these things are a bit like weather. There's lots of budget activity, then less, then more, and so on. Ultimately, we kind of get there. So, I mean, what did you think of? Have you followed any of the Mars missions,
Oh
Mary
yes,
Helen?
I've followed the Mars missions quite a bit. I was teaching Nats 1740 when those two probes both crashed that year, or and shortly thereafter. So yeah, I was quite on top of um, some of that news, and it was, the metric to standard conversion was quite a joke at the time, and I think it took NASA a while to let that one down. The other interesting thing about Phoenix too is you have to remember it also has a York University connection because they provided the LiDAR instrument that was on board the Phoenix. And I remember talking to one of the grad students at the time, um, and they were monitoring some of what was going on with this LiDAR. So there was, a connection to York too, with the Phoenix mission, because York has a lot of expertise in some of this LiDAR and atmospheric study. So it was Jim Whiteway who was involved in that too. So there is a York connection too to the Phoenix mission.
I wasn't aware of that, but I do know, of course, that York punches above its weight in a lot of areas
Yeah.
in science. We're a very good school, but interestingly, it's one of those things you always remember where you are here when you hear certain news items. You remembered hearing that. I was in the Terminal One business lounge at Air Canada Business Lounge at Pearson Airport. And a bunch of people started looking at me because the news headline came up with the explanation. And I started laughing loudly. I think people thought I was a raving lunatic. They were correct, but I had legitimate reasons to laugh at that one. So
Yeah. And it shows you how little it takes for a mission to go off the rails. Because it's like I said, something that simple. And there's just no way you can test for
no.
uh every possible sort of scenario. So you do your best and sometimes it doesn't work very well. So
Well,
I mean, but Mars overall is rather fascinating in trying to get there and some of the other missions and they're still going. I mean, Curiosity is
yep.
still running, Perseverance is still running. Uh, I, do work on impact craters, so I've been fascinated by, potentially Jezero crater and some of the other structures they're finding in it and how it compares to Earth. And of course, John Moores here at York also does some Mars atmospheric work, and I've seen some amazing images they've had of like clouds and stuff on Mars. I just
Yeah.
totally think
It's
it's like I said, there's quite a bit of York connection to the exploration.
Yeah, and when you walk around, Petrie, our science building, I think your office is I don't know if your office is in there, but I'm in a lab there, and there's posters all over the walls showing our contribution. So it's fantastic. It's really great. But speaking of other missions, you've got another
Yeah,
big
so it's like I
project.
said, I think, the space race was a huge one during the sort of 50s and 60s. It was sort of I think a real showpiece of the Cold War, of this sort of competition between the Soviet Union and the US. And of course, May 25th, 1961 is when JFK announced the goal of setting the man on the moon. And this was really a lot about the politics, and you had to beat the Russians there, because there was a lot of rumors that the Russians were getting close. Of course, the Americans had already been somewhat embarrassed because, of course, they put the first satellite into orbit. And then, of course, they put Gagarin into orbit before any American astronauts got out there. So it was sort of this idea, well, they've beat us to these ones, we're going to have to beat them to the moon. So this was when Kennedy announced that, the US's goal was to put a man on the moon and return him to Earth successfully by 1970. Um, and they did manage it. But, like that was sort of a huge political announcement at the time, because we don't think of it now, but space exploration was still very much in its infancy at that point. I mean, it was only 4 years earlier that the first Sputnik had gone up and scared the bejesus out of the Americans in the process. So this was sort of, it was about space exploration, but it was really about politics. It was really about projecting, I think, power and sort of advancement into space. But this sort of set off the whole lunar exploration that happened over the next few years by the US, right? The Russians still got there and photographed the back of the moon first with the Luna missions. But the Russians ran into some pretty severe technical problems, which left the field clear for the Americans actually to land successfully on the moon first and have sort of multiple missions that landed on the lunar surface, at which point the Russians seemed to have sort of given up because they'd been beaten to the moon. But this was really all the start of that. And there was a huge amount of funds poured into it at the time, which was kind of fascinating. So,
There's a very good TV show. It was a 10-part mini, 12-part miniseries, I think, called what was it called? From the Earth to the Moon. Tom Hanks produced it and he appeared in it as well. It was kind of a follow-on to his movie Apollo 13, but it actually goes through all of the decision trees that were made to get them there. And Kennedy made his announcement on May 25th, 1961, but he wasn't going to make that announcement until the Americans had actually put someone in space. And that was Alan Shepard,
yeah,
which was on the 5th of May.
yeah,
So it was just about well, almost 3 weeks later, he made that announcement at Rice University. But, they had to go through a decision process. What should we aim for? Because the Russians hadn't announced what they were aiming for. They were aiming for the moon, but they didn't say it. They were much more. We're gonna surprise people every step of the way. Whereas America's approach was, we're going to announce this goal and we're going to, do everything to meet it. And it was for a while, it could have gone either way. It really could have. And then, as you said, the Russians ran into some technical problems, including the death of their chief designer for their rocket and their N-1 rocket, which wasn't ready to fly. It was his moon rocket, and he died before the design could be finished. But if he'd lived, history might have told a very different tale.
yeah,
So, but following on that though. Apollo really was the ultimate space project. And on May 26th, so 1969, so 56 years ago today, Apollo 10 returned to the Earth from its mission as a test run for the manned lunar landing, which would happen less than 2 months later. The mission was a full dress rehearsal. But before we get into that, let's talk about what came earlier in Project Apollo. And it sort of ties to the point of this being a very complicated project. And sadly, it began with a tragedy. While testing a communications subsystem in the stacked Apollo 1 spacecraft, so the capsule was on top of the Saturn 1B rocket, astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee burned to death in a fire capsule, and they were still on the ground. Where NASA was really much rushing to make some impossible deadlines, and they were actually facing some pressure to get it done in 1968 rather than before 1970. And they were at the absolute limits of the technology of the day. But this event rightly ended up having, it was a tragedy, but some good things came out of it for the program, because it caused a complete program review, which almost canceled the project. But after congressional inquiry, Apollo resumed, and they were much more cautious. They had a much more heavily much heavier safety focus in the missions. And the first manned mission was Apollo 7, which was a 2-week shakedown of just the command and service module of the Apollo stack in Earth orbit. Then the next thing they were going to do was try and test the Apollo command module, service module, and the lunar module in Earth orbit. But then the CIA heard that the Soviet Union was planning a manned mission to go to the moon, circle around the back of it, not orbit it, just circle around the back of it and return. So they changed their plans. And around Christmas 1968, they sent Apollo 8 to the moon, and where it completed 10 orbits before returning to the Earth. It was also the first manned mission using the Saturn V rocket, but it didn't take the lunar module. It only was the command module, same as Apollo 7. Apollo 9 also used the Saturn V rocket, but it tested the lunar module, which was designed to carry 2 astronauts to the lunar surface, along with the command module in Earth orbit. So then finally we get to Apollo 10. And actually, I remember watching this. I was in grade five, maybe four. I was really young. I was 11, whatever the age is there for grades then. But you get to Apollo 10. The mission with a crew of Thomas Stratford, Eugene Cernan, and John Young was designed to be a complete rehearsal for the lunar landing, which was scheduled to happen later that summer. The combined lunar module, which was codenamed Snoopy, and the command module, service module, which was codenamed Charlie Brown, flew into lunar orbit. The lunar module separated from the command module and flew down to 16 kilometers above the lunar surface, tracing the route that Apollo 11 would take a couple of months later. They then ejected the lower stage of the lunar landing module, returned to the command module. Snoopy, the astronauts went back into the command module, joined John Young there, and then Snoopy was ejected into solar orbit, where it remains to this day. It is the only remaining lunar command module that wasn't crashed on the moon. It was the only one that wasn't crashed on the moon. So, maybe someday some space archaeologists will get it and return it to a museum. Charlie Brown returned to Earth and splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, and the mission was a success, as was Apollo 11 2 months later. Interestingly, of the three crew members, John Young and Gene Cernan both walked on the moon, commanding Apollo 16 and 17, respectively. Gene Cernan was, in fact, the very last person to walk on the moon. And when John Young retired, he was the most accomplished US astronaut, having flown on Gemini, Apollo, and the Space Shuttle, 2 missions each. So, I mean, they had this was the finest astronauts NASA produced. Um, One note, a personal project, because our theme today is projects, and everyone I think should have some projects they're always working on. Many years ago, I made a decision to visit each manned Apollo spacecraft. One of them, Apollo 7, and this is why I got the idea, was in Ottawa at the time. I think it's now in Seattle. So I went up there, visited it. Apollo 8 was and is still in the Museum of Science and Technology in Chicago. Apollo 9 was temporarily located in a makeshift university in upstate Michigan. It's now in San Diego. And Apollo 10 is now the only Apollo spacecraft not kept in the US, is at the London Science Museum in the UK. I did complete the project. I visited them all a number of times, but because I have family in the UK and I go most years, that's the Apollo 10 is the one I visited the most. And on the page for this podcast, there is an image I took last summer of Apollo 10 if anyone wants to take a look at it. So, do you remember any of the? I don't,
No,
Mary Helen, I don't.
I was not around when the first ones ended. Not far from it though. I vaguely old enough to just remember the last one,
Apollo,
1973.
yeah,
Vaguely.
72.
The thing is, I
Yeah.
grew up in Ottawa, so we used to go to the Science and Tech Museum where the Apollo 7 capsule was, and that was always one of my favorite displays to go and visit. So they had it there for quite a while.
A decade anyway. Yeah, it was a
And I
while.
remember visiting it multiple times, because that was sort of the big space thing in the Science and Tech Museum. And there's part of me always wondering, like, how did the Canadians actually manage to con the Americans out of that one? But yeah, so I do remember seeing that capsule quite a number of times in that museum.
I,
But otherwise, I wasn't really old enough to remember most of these.
I will confess to a small sin. That way, that capsule was positioned. You weren't supposed to touch it. Okay, and there were barriers to prevent. You could look at it, you could get pretty close, but you couldn't touch it. But I discovered at one side of it, if you really were willing to cramp your arm up, you could get in and you could touch the heat shield. And I did once, and no one caught me.
See, I
Forgive me,
remember
Father, I
that.
have sinned.
Yeah, I remember when I was small, they had steps up to it and you could look right into it and you could actually touch the side of the capsule at that point. So maybe
Okay.
something that changed at a later
Yeah.
date. But yeah, you'd walk up the steps and you'd look sort of right into where they had been sitting and you could I seem to remember you seemed to be able to touch the side of the capsule at that point, but I could be misremembering it as well. That was quite some
Yeah.
time ago. So
It's it's fascinating to go to these places, and the hardest one to find is Apollo 13, which is in a place called Hutchinson, Kansas, which is, it's not a central location by any stretch of the imagination. And all that seems to be in Hutchinson, Kansas is the Cosmodrome, which is this amazing world class, I mean, absolutely world class aerospace museum. And they've got Apollo 13. And I drove from Toronto to there. Took days.
yeah,
And
you
there's
can handle
really nothing else around, but I did it. So I was pretty pleased. So, but you're going to tell us
yeah,
about
a
another mission, I
couple, a
think.
couple, a couple of other ones. Sort of moving into the 1980s. Of course, in 1983, on May 26th, the European Space Agency launched its first X-ray observatory, the ExoSat. I did put a link to an article about this, and this was kind of fascinating because this is the point at which they were starting to get into space observing missions for larger scale structures. And then when you're above the atmosphere, of course, you can observe in other wavelengths. So that was the big push to put up these observatories that could observe in the X-ray, in the gamma, and that thing. And ExoSat was one of the early ones. And of course, every time you look in a different band, you find out many more things, right? Because you can't really observe X-ray from the surface because Earth's atmosphere blocks most of it. But when you put it above, you can now see different structures entirely. So Exosat was one of these early ones that allowed them to look at the universe from a different perspective. And then going back in history, May 28th. So around this, most people have probably heard of Percival Lowell and his observatory in Flagstaff. This is when he kind of officially arrives in Flagstaff to sort of found his observatory and get his Mars observations going, sort of going back to that Mars theme you were talking about um, earlier. And this really started, I think, some of the public interest in exploring Mars because he published a couple of books that were meant for general public consumption. And his vision of Mars is really what inspired Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom novels. So it was quite a, like that one sort of relates back to the Mars, but it also brought it into the public sphere. I mean, that's something probably NASA has been famous for over the years. They have always been so good at the public outreach and the public knowledge and spreading knowledge and making sure that people knew sort of all the neat things they were sort of doing. Right?
Yeah, NASA's amazing at it. Actually, speaking of Mars, if you are watching our OPV right now, I believe looking at it, we are looking at Mars live through our 1 meter telescope. And I always find Mars through a telescope. Mars through a spacecraft is amazing. Mars through a telescope, it's small. It's not that bright, but it's definitely orange. And you can sometimes, I think, you can make out the polar caps. So definitely, if you're around, check out our OPV right now. And that's a lot of fun. They're zooming in on it as we speak. Percival Lovell, of course, was way off base
Oh, he was
on
totally
the
wrong.
yeah on the canals of Mars.
Yeah, that
But
was that was the funny part. He was totally wrong.
he also had another project though, which was hunting for Planet Nine, and we're
Yeah.
going to come back to that in our podcast today. Um, but he was basically there were some orbital the permutations of Neptune that weren't explained, and it turned out they were later explained. But he was looking for a massive planet out further in the solar system to explain that, and by accident, Pluto was discovered, which was not the planet in question because it was very small and really didn't have the necessary mass to affect the orbits of the other planets. But yeah, Lovell was an interesting character. I've been to that observatory. It's a beautiful observatory in a great setting. And it's got a lovely probably 1.5 meter Schmidt-Cassegrain. It's just a great scope. So lots of good astronomies happened there. But I think we're coming up on half time here, so I think I need to do our reminders. So you are listening to York Universe. We are broadcasting live from the Allan I. Carswell Observatory at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. You can look at our website at yorku.ca/science/observatory to join the chat. You can, if you have questions or want to see some of our content, you're listening to Professor Mary Helen Armour and myself, Paul Mackin. We are discussing some historical items. If you're interested in our online public view, please navigate to our website and follow the links to join that fun. And as I said, right now, we're looking at Mars live on a telescope, and you can see it on the OPV. I'd like to do a couple of reminders before we get into some news items for the week. As in most, as in most weeks, we will be hosting a live tour at the observatory this Wednesday. Tickets are free and can be found on the website to get them. You don't need to pay. We ask you register. If you show up at the door, that's fine, but we prefer to register so we can get an idea of the crowd sizes and so on. And donations are always welcome. We are a student operated observatory, and donations make a big difference. On alternate weeks, we do mix those up with viewing events on the fifth floor of the Arboretum Garage at York. It's, maybe 50 meters from the observatory. And in those events, weather permitting, we'll look at some celestial objects through a number of telescopes. We alternate between observatory tours and star nights at the Arboretum on a weekly basis, weather permitting, over the spring and summer months. I also want to take a moment to discuss the York Allan I. Carswell Observatory Open Air Astro Fair, which will happen on the first clear night between June 24th and July 4th this summer. The day that it looks like it's going to be clear, we'll make an announcement at 9 a.m. as to whether this is the day or not. And the event will run from 5 p.m. until 11 p.m. There will be observing, a planetarium show, booths to buy swag, and lots of activities with many partner organizations. You can find details on how to get tickets at yorku.ca/science/observatory /astrofair, ASTROFAIR. Hope you'll come and join us. It's an excellent activity for the entire family. And when we get into the sky at night tonight, we'll talk about some of the objects you might actually be able to see. So on that point, let's move into some news. I guess I'll go first, Mary Helen. While it's still, this ties back to what we're talking about with Percival Lovell. While it's still early in the analysis phase, a possible candidate for Planet 10 has been identified. As astronomy projects go, this is a tough one and progress is slow, but it is being made. So astronomers have theorized that some orbital behavior of Kuiper belt objects might be explained by having a large planet out far in the solar system, which is tugging on them and modifying their orbits, perturbing their orbits. Kuiper belt objects, or KBOs, are generally smaller objects outside the orbit of Neptune. Pluto is one of the two largest of these found to date. It's not big enough to be a planet, as it doesn't clear out its orbital path of other objects, so it counts as a KBO. And I know that was controversial when I was growing up. It was the ninth planet, but it was always a bit of an oddball because it was so small. And every time we measured it more accurately, it got smaller. So it's appropriately called a KBO or a dwarf planet. I think that that's a totally fair classification for it. But some of these KBOs are moving in very elongated orbits and seem to cluster uh, at the outer part, around the outer part of their orbit, as if influenced by another mass even further out. This phenomena can be analyzed, and that analysis seems to indicate, a couple of astronomers have hypothesized, that a planet of 5 to 10 Earth masses on a highly eccentric and elliptical orbit with a period of up to 25,000 years could be influencing these KBOs. This is the technique that was used to find Neptune by looking at irregularities in Uranus's orbit. So, for the last number of years, there's been a lot of data analysis, and a new study was started focused on far infrared images, so infrared light, that can detect faint objects that are difficult to see in visible light. So, by comparing images from 1983 and 2006, research found an object that has moved by a small amount consistent with a large distant planet. Now, this is a promising candidate, but further analysis will be required. And many astronomers, including Mike Brown, who's one of the authors of the Planet Nine hypothesis, are skeptical as this object's orbit doesn't seem to match what was expected. And there's also other hypotheses as to how KBO clumping occurred, including, and I like this one, another star coming very close to the sun in the relative past, one that has, but that one has problems because we really can't find any evidence of that happening. The star would have to be moving very fast and be very far away now. And we should still be able to see it. And there don't seem to be any candidates. But science is like this. You don't hold on to ideas. You put your ideas out there. Maybe they become solid enough for a testable hypothesis, and and maybe those tests offer confirming evidence, which ultimately could go through a process to become a theory. To scientists, theories are not just ideas. It's not like I turn around, I've got a theory the moon is made of green cheese. You have to be able to test theories, and they have to stand up to a large amount of testing and to the vast preponderance of evidence has to support them. So this is often a confusing phrase in science theories, but a word in science theories. But a theory to a scientist is something very, very serious. We don't really define things of as laws. It's not the law of gravity. It's the theory of gravity. It's the theory of evolution is equally robust. So I don't know, Mary Ellen, any thoughts
It's
on
like I
the
said, I
scientific
think,
method?
well, I think, I think what they teach in high school sometimes is also a bit overly simplistic when we get now into complex computer modeling and everything, because it's it's nice to say there's a state from, you do observation to hypothesis to theory, but that's realistically not what happens in the actual science process. And I think sometimes even applying these names of hypothesis and theory just oversimplifies the complex kind of things that go on as you are studying objects, as you model them, as you alter your models. And sometimes you build a model and I mean, the most fascinating object is black holes because they were speculating about their existence back in the 1800s. Einstein's theory of gravity then sort of brought out that, yes, these could actually exist. And then, of course, in the early 1970s, we found the X, I can't remember, is it X something in Cygnus? So
Cygnus X-ray 1.
yeah, Cygnus X-ray one. I mean, it's a nice idea, but I think this idea of attaching some sort of importance to hypothesis or theory, scientists don't sit around and talk in those terms a lot of the time, right? It's a very simple way of looking at the scientific process, but when you actually get into it, there's so much more to it. And the Planet X is a fascinating one because that has been going on for generations. And this idea of this long orbit planet has been floating around there. I don't know if you remember some of the stuff about, was it Nibiru, they called it.
Hmm.
So the problem too with the Planet X, and it's true of Mars to some extent as well, is there gets to be so much sort of urban legend and sort of cultural interest developed around it that yeah, it now becomes hard sometimes to separate the fact from the fiction. I mean, with Mars, that's very much in some ways the case because a lot of people still like originally like saw Mars in sort of through Edgar Rice Burroughs and Lowell's eyes of this sort of, habitable place. And the first images from the Mariner mission just totally threw that out the window, right? Similarly with Venus, they thought it was this warm, hot planet. Dinosaurs running around in the tropics, and then the first sort of real observations realized that it's nothing like that at all. So it's interesting to see how, we start with these ideas based on early observations, and as we go through it, how much it changes. Like the search for Planet X, it's like I said, has been going on pretty much since they found Pluto, with some of it being like this more serious science and analysis of orbits, and some of it being sort of way out there. I mean, if you don't if you're interested in this, don't Google Planet X.
Yeah.
That's a big mistake. Start at a reputable place like NASA and say, type in things like search for 10th planet because there is so much sort of I don't know what you even call it anymore, urban legend nonsense never floating around out there that it starts to make it hard to do the serious science, and it also adds to a lot of skepticism then because scientists are saying, look, like there's been so much BS over the years, you've got to come out with something really, really convincing, um, for me not to think that this is just more hype.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Someone's internet theory, and you've plugged a video on TikTok and it's got nothing to do with reality.
Well, I
And it
mean,
makes it harder to do the work too.
yeah, and I mean, if you want to look up, a lot of internet noise, look up the face on Mars. That's another example. There's so many things like that, and I always think, the science is so much more interesting than the noise, but there's so much noise. There's
Well,
so much
the
noise.
really interesting one for the face on Mars, I saw quite a number of years ago, and I used to use the image in some of my astronomy classes. I haven't used it recently. Some guy actually took a higher resolution image of it and traced out a hiking trail up the side of how you could get to sort of the summit of the quote unquote face. Because when you look at it in more detailed, higher resolution imagery, the face disappears. And so he actually figured out from the elevation how you could hike up the side of this thing, figuring if we ever get to Mars, it's going to be a great tourist attraction. And I thought this was just priceless. So in my class, I used to show like the fuzzy, 1970s, oh, it looks like a face, to sort of the modern, I think it was global surveyor image, quite detailed, different shadows entirely, and with this hiking trail up the side of it. And students were like, oh, that's not so much fun anymore. I said, yeah, but imagine if you could actually go there and hike up it now. So
It's yeah, well, the gravity is a bit lower, but then again, you have to carry your environment with you, so it wouldn't. I don't imagine it would be fun. I think many years ago there was a book written. Uh, Hammer of God
oh
by
gosh, yes.
Arthur Clarke, and he actually hypothesized, using the wrong word. He came up with this great idea of having the Olympics on the moon in low gravity. And, it had both good points and bad points, but it was a lot of fun. Oh.
Yeah.
But speaking of things that we didn't know about and we
Yeah,
learned
one
existed.
one of the ones I've followed sort of over the last couple of years now since it's gotten operational is the James Webb telescope. And it's fascinating because as I was talking about, like you had the European one that had X-ray. Now you have JWST that does infrared. And infrared is really neat because it can tell you a lot about sort of chemical compositions in atmospheres and stuff like that. So one of the debates that was going on recently is about, of course, K218b, which came out in the news, and oh, we found chemicals that are signs of life and everything. And this tipped off a whole lot of debate. And a lot of people have now looked at the data and said, you're really overinterpreting this, and the signal isn't quite strong enough to make the conclusions that, you kind of put out there. I think scientists are equally guilty sometimes of being overly optimistic in interpreting their data and wanting to sort of stamp their name on a discovery. So there's a lot of discussion right now about what the results from K2 that planet actually mean, what is actually in the atmosphere, and whether the signal they saw really reflects what they're claiming it to reflect. But in other cases, they're doing some work. HD 181327 is actually a very young star. It's only a few million years old. And this paper that came out, about a week or so ago, and a couple of articles I saw, they were talking very much about having found water in the protoplanetary disk. So this star doesn't have planets yet. It's a very young star. It still seems to have like one of those disks around it, and they think they have found water in the disk, which is fascinating because, of course, we do think in Earth's solar system, the presence of water was really key in particularly formation in the outer solar system, where you get all these icy moons, and eventually out you get all the KBO objects and everything. And they think because Jupiter formed out here, this is part of the reason it got to be so large so quickly. So this is another one of these sort of very recent discoveries, but it also helps us understand our own solar system better as well. I mean, people are like, well, what's the point of looking so far away? But if you're going to study planets, we only have a few here. The more we can find, the better we can understand, right? And I think humans are just geared on some level to want to explore and to want to go from the known to the unknown. That's what drove us from, to spread across the globe in many ways, the good, bad, and ugly. And now to plan missions to the moon and the Mars. I think without this, humanity really loses some of its, identity when we don't have this drive. If you stop this exploration, if you stop this drive to always sort of look what's over the next hill, so to speak.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when it comes to the discovery of exoplanets and discoveries about particular exoplanets, there's one thing to keep in mind. I mean, we know what, I remember in the 90s they discovered the first exoplanet,
51
and
Peg, yeah.
yeah, yeah, and it was I think it was basically by a Doppler effect in the spectra. They found it, and then they improved their techniques. But here we are now, and I just, as you were talking, looked up the current number of discovered exoplanets confirmed. Five as of May 22nd, so 4 days ago, 5,903 exoplanets. Well, I think it was only like 18 months ago. I looked and it was like 2,000 or maybe three, but the number is going up dramatically. And so we are going to find a lot of different things. Eventually we're probably going to find more planets that have some credible or less credible signs that there could be biochemical processes on them or chemical processes that could be biological in nature. Similarly, we might, or right now, one of the problems is that the planets we're finding are often very close to their host star. Those might not be ideal candidates for the search for life, but again, we learn things from them. I was talking to one of my colleagues today at school, and he's working on lava planets, and
Those are fascinating.
yeah, I mean, but you've got planets that are so close to their star, they're probably inside, the chromosphere of the star, and the temperature is extremely high. So, there's those planets may not last that long, right? But there's also a lot of very small stars Probably the biggest spectral class is M type, and they may have planets and they're cooler stars. So even though the planet might be totally locked and in orbit about it, it might be in a habitable zone. We don't know, but we're learning a lot, and the data is coming incredibly quickly. And one of the things, to go back to uh, the issue we talked about a minute ago with Planet Nine. We're about to turn on a faucet when it comes to a fire hose, when it comes to data, when Vera Rubin comes online, which is this August, because it's going to be looking at the entire night sky every 3 days over in its location. And the amount of data we'll get just from seeing day-to-day changes down to magnitude 27, optimized for infrared. Wow, it's going to be the amount of data we're going to get. And actually getting through that data is going to be very, very difficult. So the number 5,903 of exoplanets, maybe you and I will host another podcast together in the fall, and it'll be 6,500. I don't know what it'll be, but maybe we should do that. We should set that as in September or October, we'll look at it again. And it gives you an idea of how much data is coming in, how quickly. It's a fantastic time to be working in astronomy and in science in general.
Oh, it's like I said, as computers improve, as CCDs improve. I mean, I remember when they were developing the Kepler mission, and one of their big problems was they knew how much data they were going to produce with the array of CCDs and stuff. And it was like, how do we get this data back to Earth? Like this was one of their issues of trying to figure out like how to stream this much data back. And as the telescopes get bigger and bigger, especially the space-based ones, it's just like, how do you store and move this much data? And what's fascinating too is a lot of these astronomical databases are becoming entirely open access. I mean, your PI gets his data, for the first couple of years, and after that, it's like, look, we're just going to put this all online so that any scientist can access it because these projects are so expensive. You want to squeeze every little bit out of the data you can, and by making it available to just about anybody to work on, you can bring in people who weren't even thinking. Like the Kepler mission was supposed to be about finding exoplanets, but a lot of the guys doing like binary stars discovered there's a lot of stuff in here that we could really sink our teeth into. So, like
Absolutely.
you have more than one way in which that data can be used, right? Like you
Yeah.
have and there was so much variable star data in there, for example, too. So it's like, well, we set out to do this, but we collected so much data. There's so many other things we can do with it, right? So it's these projects become so fascinating, like whether it's JWST, whether it's Vera Rubin, it's just the sheer volume of data you have
It's
become
incredible.
massive to keep up.
Looking just at Vera Rubin, I just ran some numbers, and 20 terabytes data per night, 60 petabytes over 10 years, and the process data will be up to 500 petabytes after data processing. It'll be a catalog of 40 billion astronomical sources, um, and there will be 30 trillion time-dependent brightness measurements over a 10-year mission. Like just the data, managing the data science alone for that is going to be incredible.
Yeah.
So, but much closer to home, maybe we should, in our last few minutes, talk about the sky at night just with our eyes, just with our eyes. We don't have to worry about 3 gigabyte Vera Rubin cameras. We're heading into summer, and the nights when they're clear as they seem to be tonight offer so many opportunities to do some stargazing. And it's difficult in Toronto, but the further you get out, you don't have to get too far out of the city to start getting slightly better skies. So let's start with being closer to Earth. The easiest object to see in the night sky is the moon, except you will not see it tonight. It's a new moon. You can't see it tonight due to its position relative to the Earth and the sun. Tomorrow night, you should see a slim crescent moon low in the western sky at sunset. It will rise a little bit earlier each night and become a little fuller. And then the first quarter, when half the moon's illuminated, is June 2nd, and the full moon is June 11th. And this month it's called the strawberry moon. I have no idea why. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that was a thing when I was younger, but it's a thing now. They seem to have a name for
Well,
every
I
moon.
suspect it goes back to the old agriculture elements because, of course, this is the time of year when strawberries are.
Yeah, it may well.
And it may have to do something with atmospheric conditions that cause a moon to look much more red.
Maybe. I know it gets certainly, you get the harvest moon phenomena in the fall, but anyway, the 18th of June will be the third quarter, and it'll rise around midnight, and then the new moon again on June 25th. Venus and Saturn grace our early morning skies in the east, and if you're an early riser, they should both be quite visible about 5 a.m. Now, just a reminder to everyone, if you're looking at Saturn right now with a telescope, do not expect to see rings. We're at a point in the planetary dance between us and Saturn where the rings are kind of edge on, and they're very, very thin. This happens every 13 years or so, but fear not, they'll reappear in a couple of months. Um, Jupiter, bright and lovely, is setting about 45 minutes after sunset. And if you look at it with binoculars or a small telescope in the west as dusk hits, you will see its moons. You could see a couple of moons, up to four. Um, it will be in conjunction with the sun by the end of the end of June, so you won't see it. Mars is a bit higher in the west, but it's much fainter. Um, and as we saw it on the telescope tonight, it's quite a small object in a telescope. It sounds very interesting, exotic, but I always say if you're doing street astronomy, show the moon first, show Jupiter second, show Saturn third, because people, when you show them Mars, they're generally disappointed. Mars is great through spacecraft, but through a telescope, you need a pretty big scope to make it out. But right now is not the best month for planets, really. You've got Jupiter setting early. Mars is kind of faint and not in great position. Saturn and Venus are early in the morning. But there are many nice objects to view in the night sky over the summer, particularly if you can access a small telescope or come by one of our observatory tours. Recently, I picked up an inexpensive smart telescope. These are low cost. You can't look through them, but you can hook them to your phone and take pictures of objects. They're not great for planets because of the small aperture, but they're good for deep spy objects. And there's a catalog of these things called the Messier catalog, which contains 110 fuzzy things in the night sky. Charles Messier cataloged them to avoid looking for comets, which was what he was really looking for. It is possible to view all 110 Messier objects in a single night at certain times of the year. My goal, my project, far less ambitious than that, is to photograph them all with my smart telescope over the next year. And summer's a great time for this. Now, you don't need a telescope to find a few of these. Binoculars will do, but in the west after sunset, you can see, in the east after sunset, you can see several globular clusters, several open clusters, some galaxies and nebula. It's worth trying. And if you can get to a deep sky preserve here in Ontario, whether you live, and you can just look up Google deep sky preserves, then you can bask in the beauty of the Milky Way uh, during the summer skies. Astronomy clubs have viewing events. You can always send us questions about these events in the York University area. So, try to get out this summer, put on a bit of insect repellent because there can be mosquitoes, but get out in the fresh air and look up.
Yeah.
It really is worth doing. And, winter's got some beautiful things to see, but it's cold and you get a lot more cloudy nights. Summer's the time to rock astronomy. What do you think, Mary Helen?
Well, I do the astronomer in residence in Killarney. I've been up there the last 2 years, and I've been lucky. I've been there sort of late July, early August. So the mosquitoes are brutal, but we've had some amazing. I've had some amazing Perseid
Uh,
viewing.
August,
We've had
yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean we've had like you sit there and if you're looking in the right direction, you see them coming by fairly regularly. And both years I've seen at least a couple of fireballs, like the larger ones
That's
streak
great.
across. So it's a
Yeah.
great time. That one's a great time of year to be out. It's like you said, put on the mosquito repellent because it can be pretty
Yeah.
nasty. Um,
Yeah. Keep a
but
can of off in the
Killarney,
car.
yeah,
Yeah.
Killarney is a dark sky area, so it is a great place to go for that kind of thing. But there are a few locations around.
Yeah. Yeah, I go to one near Kincardine. They're all over. But I think we're at time.
Yep.
So I will say thank you first of all, Mary Helen, for joining me tonight. You've been listening to the York Universe, the Astronomy and Astrophysics podcast, written and presented by the students, faculty, alumni, and friends of York University. Your host this evening has been Professor Mary Helen Armour and myself, Paul Mackin. This podcast and past episodes are available wherever podcasts are distributed. You can always connect with us on Instagram at the handle at Yorkview Observatory, on Facebook at Allan I. Carswell Ob. Our website is yorku.ca/science/observatory. And we have a lot of interesting content there. And if you're so inclined, it's a great place to make a donation. We would thank you for it. It's tax deductible in Canada. We're a student operated, not for profit observatory and guarantee the money all goes to running the observatory. So thanks for tuning in this evening. We wish you clear skies and a good night.